My name is Abhijit. I've been with the university for many years now. Some of you may have interacted with me in one form or another.
I'm Jeff. I've been at the university for about 6 months in this role. I've been here before working on the web for several years.
Hey everyone, I'm Alex Waterman. I started here at OSU in October. Before doing web accessibility, I was working in the healthcare field. I'm still learning, but happy to help answer any questions.
So welcome by everybody. Thanks for coming in. Today, we're talking about best practices with web accessibility, and we're also going to introduce you to members of our web accessibility team. So this is a very brief outline of what we're going to cover. So for the most part, we are going to introduce to you some basic web accessibility guidelines and best practices. This is also going to essentially cover other things like files such as video, media, documents, audio, PowerPoint slides, things like that. Anything that can be displayed or put on the web, we are going to kind of show you some best practices on how to make that accessible. For a lot of people who've been to our past presentations before, some of this will probably be review, but we're trying to kind of keep this a little bit more interesting so you can actually meet some more members of the web services team. So with that said, let's get started. So what is accessible content in the context of the web? Accessible content is any media that allows a person with a disability to do all the following: acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as any person without a disability. There's a little bit more to it than just that, though. So to make sure that your content is accessible to people with disabilities, that content must also be equally effective, equally integrated, and have a substantially equal ease of use for folks with disabilities. So for the most part, the person with a disability must be able to obtain the information as fully, equally, and independently as anybody else without a disability. And this is me kind of rehashing what I just said earlier. Accessible content basically is just content that lets folks with disabilities access the same information with basically the fully equal, independent use, ease as anybody without a disability. So this might seem kind of intuitive, but here are some reasons why accessibility really matters, especially when it comes to making your content accessible, right? So according to the Centers of Disease and Control, 1 in 4 adults in the US have some kind of disability, which can impact tasks, especially when they're kind of using the web. If we don't work to make the web accessible, we're risking barring almost a quarter of the population from participating online. And that means people with disabilities won't be able to do things like take online classes, keep up with friends who move long distances, or access information with ease and use as anyone without a disability. So that kind of goes without saying, making your content accessible matters a lot, and it makes a big deal in the daily life of someone with a disability. So to kind of help you along the way of making your content accessible, we're going to kind of walk through some basic best practices to achieve that. And most of this is going to cover things that you do on a typical day-to-day basis, right? So sometimes that will be things like working with headings. If you're working with web pages, a lot of this will apply to you, but a lot of this information also applies to things like Word documents, Google Documents as well, PowerPoint slides, video, anything like that. A lot of this will also cover images, since that's kind of a big deal, mostly because of how tricky alt text is. And we're going to cover that in a little bit too. So I'm going to just hop in right in. So the very first thing I want to cover is headings. So headings are basically just tags, short descriptions that give web pages and documents this logical sequential structure on a page. Some of the things I'm going to say might seem obvious to you, but I bring them up because I usually will see some issues. So if it seems like I'm going over something that seems very basic, there's a good reason for it, because it's just something I've come across. So naturally, headings describe all the content that follow or are underneath it. You can apply headings with Drupal's built-in header or whatever application you're using to make media, documents. Most programs have some kind of built-in header feature. If you like messing around HTML, it's usually just the H1 tag. Now, the big thing when it comes to headers or headings is that they usually have a very specific use case. So for example, H1, heading 1, that's usually something like the title of a page. It describes pretty much most of the information on a page. What's it going to be about right before you even get to the content itself. So things like heading 2, those are more like the building blocks, the sections, the main parts of any web page, media file, document, things like that. And it kind of descends down from there, kind of breaking things down. Heading 3s are kind of part of sections and heading 2s, and so on and so forth. It follows that sequential logical structure. One thing that I would really, really like to point out, and this is something I have seen before too, so I'm kind of making a big deal about it here, is that you should never use heading structure for visual styling alone. I've seen people in the past usually try to make entire paragraphs just look bigger, make their text look a lot larger, more stylistic by turning it into a heading. And that causes a lot of problems for readability. For somebody who is reliant on a screen reader, for example, you could potentially mess that screen reader up because it is trying to read off that information in a way that's logical, and it might confuse the person who is relying on that if you have, say, entire paragraphs that are heading 1 or heading 2. So I would definitely recommend avoiding using heading structure for visualization and decoration. So here's the big one, and this is going to take up a little bit of time, but that's just because it's like the most tricky when it comes to web accessibility, surprisingly. So images and alt text. So for a lot of you who are working in Drupal in particular, you realize that our websites are built in a way that make you add alt text to images before you upload them. And that's just to ensure that folks with disabilities are able to basically get the same information as anybody without a disability from an image. So alt texts are not difficult per se, but they can be tricky. So there's a balance that you have to meet between being concise, being short or straight to the point, and describing an image, but you also want to be as descriptive as possible. So there's that balance, but these best practices should help you guide you along just in case. So we're going to talk quite a bit about alt text, right? So we've already mentioned that alt text must be concise and accurate in terms of conveying the information of an image. And likewise, must not be too short or undescriptive. And you can see to the right here, I made a couple of examples of what's good alt text and what is poor alt text. And it might seem kind of intuitive about how alt text should be, but again, I made a bad example for you because I have found examples just like that on one or more of our websites. So I'm not trying to shame anybody. I'm just trying to point out that this is what bad alt text can look like. Anyway, alt text when it comes to images containing words. So this could be anything like memes, comics, graphics, things that communicate some information like that. Alt text basically has to convey the same information as an image with text on it. So if you have an image that has an event for a date, that alt text needs to convey that same information too. But like I said, alt text can be tricky sometimes. And if you're not familiar with it, or you are not aware of the best practices when it comes to alt text, it's pretty easy to mess up and cause problems for folks, mainly folks who rely on screen readers. So moving on from just alt text in general, image placement. So this will mostly concern you if you are working with images in things like Google or Word documents and how they align with text. So the safest bet when you're either working in a web page in Drupal or you're working in a document or anything like that is to make the image basically inline. So that means essentially the image is usually right above or right below text. There's no wrapping involved. However, you can wrap text around an image. So if you read anything like for example, a news article or anything like that, it's very common to see text wrapped around images, and that can be done. It's just that if you're working in something like Word or a Google Doc, you will want to make sure you test the image, usually by running through an accessibility checker or by some other means, just to make sure that it's not causing any issues with readability. Mostly because images can sometimes throw off the logical order of text for folks who are, for example, relying on a screen reader. And we have some more to describe about alt text. This kind of gets into a more detailed description of what I mentioned earlier about being brief, but also being descriptive as possible. So for example, to the right, we have an image of a male peacock. It's just a headshot. And I included some ways to basically describe this in a way that is avoiding any of the issues I've mentioned before. So for example, we can describe the image of this peacock to the right here as a male peacock with short, curled metallic blue feathers on its head. Likewise, we can also call it, or use the alt text to describe it as a male peacock with a fan-shaped crest on its head with bare black shafts and bluish green tips. There's quite a few ways you can go about it, but usually this kind of format here is the go-to when it comes to writing alt text for images. You want to avoid the longer descriptions as much as possible, because if someone is using a screen reader, then it's communicating a lot of information that it essentially becomes harder to process. So you want to avoid kind of keeping your alt text descriptions long-winded. So we want to avoid repeating information. Basically, alt text shouldn't be necessarily identical information as text within the context of an image. A big thing here, and admittedly, I am pretty guilty of this, is when it comes to writing alt text, you want to avoid phrases like image of, graphic of, picture of, headshot of, etc. when you're describing images. This is because assistive technologies usually will announce the presence of an image to a user. So it kind of just creates a very redundant experience for folks with screen readers, for example. So usually just describing the image is straightforward without including picture of, image of, graphic of, usually saves you and the other person using some assistive device a lot of trouble. So lastly, this is where things might seem a little bit more complicated here. This is alt text in the context of flowcharts, graphs, and things like that. And members of the web accessibility team can definitely chime in on this if they want to here, because this is where things get a little bit more tricky than just describing a picture of a bird, right? So diagrams. If they are the sole source of information, the alt text has to convey that same data and information that the diagram is showing, right? So if you look to the right, All of this could be alt text. And again, feel free to correct me, Jeff, Abhijit, Alex, if you want to. Basically, I provided an overview of what the diagram above is showing here, the values that are in the diagram itself, and the presentation, basically describing the visual parts of it, representing the number of visitors per month for each website. What is the chart trying to communicate here? So, like I said, this can be pretty tricky here. If the graph is a visual representation of information that's already explained in a text, right? And this could be something like a pie chart that already has information provided. You can use diagram as described in text for its alt text. So again, if it's got like a bunch of textual information that's already communicating that information, right? That's not in the image itself, then you can just say the diagram is described already in the text. So we're finally moving on from images and accessibility. We are going to move on to colors now, which is kind of related, but it has its own nuances here and there. So colors, the big thing that you want to concern yourself mostly with color use and accessibility is making sure that there is enough contrast between stuff like background and text. So the good news is that if there's something that you're curious about, if you're wondering if there is a sufficient use in color here and there are plenty of free contrast checkers that you can use to make sure, basically to get like a good idea of if this is acceptable or not, or if this is an adequate use of contrast when you're using colors, right? So this can include colors in terms of text, images, and buttons. So it's not just in terms of background and text, but that includes other visual cues, visual information, links, things like that, that could help stand out here and there. So this also covers any colors that convey information on diagrams, maps, other types of images that need to be distinguishable. So for example, if you're using the exact same icon in different, so basically if you have a diagram, for example, and you rely on the same icon for whatever reason to help certain kinds of images stand out, then you will definitely want to use different colors to convey how these things are different. So that said, color is pretty useful for representation to basically help information stand out and to convey information. But you also have other ways of doing that as well. So you don't want to just limit how you convey information or data or making certain things stand out with just color. But color plays a pretty big role in that. One final thing that I would like to add as well is, and we don't really think about this often, is that color can have different meanings depending on a user's cultural background. So red, for example, might usually in our own culture, it's typically kind of to indicate something like warning. It's bright, it's energetic. But in other cultures, it might convey something much more different. Also, like when it comes with colors like green. Green is a pretty standard color. We usually use that for all kinds of things, but depending on the culture of a user, and this depends on your intended audience, that might indicate something else. So it's something that's not necessarily covered a lot in most discussions when it comes to color and accessibility, but it's just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind about. So that's my rant about colors. We're moving on to tables now. So tables and documents and PDFs. This also includes web pages as well. But first, we're going to mostly cover how tables work, documents, PDFs, those kind of files. So tables must have column and row headers. So if you look to the right, there's a header row and there's another row basically describing what each of these is. But this is what this is mostly stressing. So column headers would be food, purchased, sold, remaining. The row headers are apples, bananas, mac and cheese, mangoes, and ziti, all the foods that this is concerned with. When you are making a table in a document or a PDF, one thing you want to avoid doing is using the tab ruler or any of those other kind of tools that don't involve the inbuilt table tool to align columns of data. You strictly want to use a table to display information as a table. This includes aligning content with tabs to make them look like table. That's something we would recommend avoiding for the most part. Avoiding using rulers to align images to make tables. This is kind of what I've already mentioned before. It's just focusing on creating tables with whatever programs and build table tool you have, and not using things like images or JPEGs to display information like that. Using tables only for data, never for layout or decoration. That's a pretty big one. A lot of people can get a little overboard and carried away when it comes to creating tables on a web page or a document. And that can really cause a lot of problems. It can make a document almost completely unreadable for someone using an assistive device. So this is something you would want to avoid doing, using a table just for stylistic or decorative purposes. Lastly, when it comes to tables and documents, PDFs, things like that, you want to avoid using merged or blank cells on a table. Those can typically cause a lot of other problems as well. They can throw off the order, they can cause a lot of issues. So we would recommend avoiding using the merged and blank cells. So that said, tables on web pages. Personally, I typically advise people to avoid using tables on a web page. There are certain examples where it is acceptable though to do that. It's just that you want to avoid creating very wide tables when doing that, because they're not mobile friendly and they can usually break. Like if you see to the right, the image I have here is a table on just a Drupal page. And it lists days from Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. When in mobile view, which is what this image, this screenshot is, it starts to cut off. And it's not mobile friendly because there's no way to side scroll to see what that other information is. So that's the big thing generally when it comes to creating tables on any web page. If it's not very wide, you can get away with it, but it can be pretty tricky. And I typically just recommend people using lists. We can go further into detail about that later on if you have any questions regarding tables. And speaking of lists, this is a pretty easy one. Lists are generally a pretty easy to use way of accessibly displaying a lot of information at once. So I typically will use lists if I have a series of items that I'm trying to describe. So whether it's names, people, steps for how to do things, or just other things like that, I typically create lists. They're generally the safest way to go, but here are some of the guidelines for creating and using lists on documents or web pages here. So you can format lists using the inbuilt list tool on basically any application that you're using, right? That said, lists aren't the only acceptable way for formatting things like, let's say, instructional content or data, things like that. We covered before how you can have images, or you could use things like diagrams. And we've covered how to accessibly use that to display that kind of information as well. So don't think that you are strictly restricted to only ever creating lists here and there. So that said, you could also use lists to structure things such as long documents, content outlines, page outlines, things like that. Basically, they're very useful for kind of highlighting a lot of information in major sections of a web page or a document here. So the correct list types are ordered, which are basically just your numbered ones, right? These are useful if the list that you're trying to convey, the information that you need to get across, is chronological or hierarchical. So if you're including steps on how to do something, right? For example, what we have on the right, it's pretty straightforward stuff. Proof of conference, paper acceptance, proof of external funding, basically just kind of making sure that your user knows that these are the steps they have to follow in order to complete like a task, right? And then there's the unordered variety, which if we look to the right down here for student resources, there's really no necessary hierarchy here at work. There's no steps that need to necessarily be followed. It's just listing related information, such as student resources to undergraduate students, graduate students, things like that here. So that's the end of my rant about lists. We are almost through this, by the way. So formatting and layout. This is a big thing, and it ties into a lot of what I've already discussed regarding lists, images, alignment, things like that. If you have something like a PDF document, right? They must be OCR, which members of my team can describe a little bit more in detail during the Q&A. Basically, it's just making sure that that text is readable either by being scanned or by some other means. And the text has to be selectable, it has to be properly tagged, and it has to have a logical reading order. And I'm going to reference to the right here, this image of using Zoom. This is from a web page, basically just describing how to use Zoom at a conference. And there's a logical order, some quick facts. There's a clear structure that's easy to follow. The information is pretty concise, and things are bolded and highlighted as needed. This is kind of like a very good example of a well-formatted and laid out document. You want to avoid doing things like underlining text for emphasis, mostly because that tends to cause confusion for users. Then they might tend to think that whatever is highlighted or underlined might be a link. So it's pretty common when it comes to web pages. We associate anything that's underlined to be a link. Unless there's like a clear difference in color, then it might not be so obvious that the thing that you're trying to emphasize is a link or just some text that you want to highlight. It's better to kind of bold or italicize that text to draw emphasis. That way you avoid confusion of if this is a link or not for users here. Obvious one, and I feel like I shouldn't have to necessarily describe this one, but it happens from time to time. Making sure you're checking for spelling or grammar. If you're doing something like making a web document or a Word document, I mean, there are inbuilt tools that allow you to check for grammar and spelling. It's recommended that you run and use these tools before you publish a document on a website or anything like that, especially given the fact that we're representing a public land-grant institution. That said, documents are consistent in style and navigation. This is a pretty big deal. It's just making sure that a user who is let's say, for example, you have a potential student and they're interested in programs at your specific department. If you have something like syllabi or program outlines, things like that, you want to make sure that they have this consistent structure just so they know better where to find information like credit hours or requirements, things like that. It just makes it easier to navigate for everyone. And again, for somebody with a disability, that can make it much easier for them to navigate as well. So left justified text, don't use full justification. Less justified in terms of web writing or anything like that. It's just for some reason how we read and process text on a monitor or a screen. We do it from left to right, usually in this F shape. And for someone with a screen reader, they might also be accustomed to that too. Depending on the device or the program they're using, it might also be built in a way or designed in a way to basically process text on a page left justified. Full justified basically is more like where the text is fully aligned. It's like even blocks of text, which make it very difficult to read for everybody, right? And it can make it harder to navigate and find key information too. So just keep things usually left aligned or left justified here and there. Using common or easy to read fonts. So you want to avoid using any fonts that are decorative, cursive, things like that. You just want to stick with safe common fonts like Arial, Calibri, Helvetica, Times New Roman, or whatever it is you're doing. It's not just because it's conventional, but it just makes it easier to read for people who have a disability. Using a size minimum of 11 or 12 size point font, I typically recommend people keep their font sizes around 12. It's just usually the safer size to be at, and it just makes it just a little bit easier to read. But 11 is also a pretty fine choice too. Unless you are creating headings, you don't necessarily want to go any bigger than that. Spacing in between lists or lines or paragraphs, this is a pretty common problem I see. It's just making sure that when you have like a long list, for example, like the page I have here, unless I have like a few things in a list, right, then I will typically have maybe like a few things without an extra space. But if, as just a rule of thumb, to make things easier to read for everybody, including people with disabilities, it's always safe to just create this extra space in between paragraphs, things like that. It makes it easier to navigate for everyone too. And it's just something that I particularly like to stress on. So this includes brief information, best practices about audio, video, and slides. So when it comes to either PowerPoint slides or the Google equivalent to that, I'm not sure off the top of my head what that is, but essentially you want to create any slides using accessible templates. The slides themselves have to have descriptive titles. The titles have to be unique. When it comes to font sizes, you can use a minimum of 24-point font size along with white space to make your slides easier to navigate for everybody. This can also impact how someone with an accessibility device or an assistive device might be navigating your PowerPoint slides. And when it comes to video and audio stuff, which most of the time you're probably not working with in your day-to-day job, but it's just really helpful to kind of have this information in mind. Very important, videos have to have captions. This includes audios as well. There has to be some text version or some kind of text available to display the information for someone with a disability. Whether it's on YouTube, which uses its own caption generation feature, which is fairly reliable, but for the most part, if you want to ensure you have accurate captioning, it's usually best to consult one of the teams or offices that perform that service for you. I think OneDrive has its own caption feature as well. That's something that our guests can kind of walk through and go into greater detail about. But yeah, just making sure that stuff has copies of transcripts available, things like that are very important, whether it's an MP3, an MP4, or any of those other kind of formats for video and audio. And that covers it for all the best practices. I know that's a lot of information, but at some point I would like to make on our user knowledge base something more easy to reference. So at some point in the future, that's something I'm going to be working on, just so you have a easy to use cheat sheet, if you will, for some of those accessibility best practices. So that said, that's enough of me going through all that information for you. This is the part where I want to introduce members of our web accessibility team. So that's going to be Abhijit Barde, Jeffrey Borish, and Alex Waterman. So would you guys introduce yourselves?
My name is Abhijit. I've been with the university for many years now. Some of you may have interacted with me in one form or another. I started with the accessibility team approximately about 18 months ago. We are still in maybe not even that much, but we are still in the process of getting the team organized in such a way that it has a clear focus and begins to help the college in a way that is useful, productive, and generally affects the course content that is used, the websites that are used by everybody, and all that hasn't fully fallen in place. But our hope is that in the next few months, we'll have a fully fleshed out website or a microsite within the college infrastructure that not only gives you an introduction to who we are, what we do. We may start having office hours of our own, in addition to all the resources such as the things that Zach talked about today. So, Jeff, if you want to take over.
First, Zach, that was a fantastic amount of information that you crammed into, what was it, about 45 minutes? So thanks for putting that together. I'm Jeff. I've been at the university for about 6 months in this role. I've been here before working on the web. I've been working on off and on in the web for several years, but I'm happy to be here and working on accessibility.
Hey everyone, I'm Alex Waterman. I started here at OSU in October. Before doing web accessibility, I was working in the healthcare field, so I'm still learning, but happy to help answer any questions.
All right, thanks everybody. So yeah, if there's anything that you guys would like to talk about more about yourselves, background, feel free. But given the fact that we are 13 till, I want to give the rest of the time for any of the audience questions. So you're free to unmute and just ask directly if you've got any questions about accessibility.
Hi, I have a question about headings and websites. For accordions on the Drupal sites, are the accordion titles and section titles automatically formatted as certain heading levels? How should we handle those as it relates to headings and making sure we have the right kind of nested levels on our pages?
Jeff, you want to take that?
I don't know what the formatting is. I don't know when you do that. I don't know how it comes out in there, but yes, that is something that needs to be considered when you're putting those things into a page. We're working on issues like that as we're coming up with new interface standards that are going to be rolled out across the sites that we are building. So yeah, that's something to look at and something to keep in mind. It's sort of like if you end up with headers that are out of order. I've heard this from people who use the assistive technology, but it's really nice when they are perfect. But if they're not perfect, it's not the end of the world. And that they'd rather people focus on things that happen all the time that really do cause barriers to their access. Hope that helps.
Yep, thank you.
The way they are right now is not bad at all. They seem to function reasonably well within the screen readers, but I do know that an improvement is in the works.
Awesome. You guys are free to either type any more questions you have in the chat, or you're free just to kind of unmute and just ask your questions. I think we can go through some of the questions that we haven't answered in the chat yet. So Jeff, I really appreciate you going through and kind of keeping tabs on that. Were there any questions that we have maybe not looked at yet? I see Gabe's question. Buckeye
I'm sorry,
Sand.
I completely missed the chat questions.
It's okay. I assume Buckeye Sans and Buckeye Serif have both been cleared as easy to read fonts, right? Would you guys like to weigh in on that?
Yes, they've been approved by the University's Marketing and Communications Office, so I would say yes.
How do you suggest ASC site users format text to be larger without using the heading structure, since our WYSIWYG editor does not give us font size as an option? I know how to do this with HTML, but most of our editors do not, which is a really good question. You guys like to weigh in on that?
Is there a reason why you would want to make the font size larger?
Yeah,
Gabe?
I mean, just general like visual hierarchy in the page and all that, but sometimes it's not actually related to the structure. So I'm thinking like in the use in call out boxes and stuff like that. So obviously I'm not looking to turn paragraphs into, 58-point font, but sometimes there's reasons that stylistic, especially like we're the Department of Design.
Right.
Like sometimes you want to do an event page or something that has a little bit more flair to it. Well, you don't want to, what I'm trying to do is get more of our designers to not just want to embed all that text into images and stuff. Then we want to do it through HTML so that it is more screen readable. But yeah, if we have to hand code it all then that is a different skill set as well, right?
This is true. And in the editor that's available within Drupal, you can see the code and you can manipulate some of the code if you're familiar with it. But what I would like to do is generally there are constraints placed on how text gets displayed within the college infrastructure templates. Those are the websites that we all see. But I can confirm, Gabe, with the person who manages those templates and get back with you on that.
Thank you. It just seems like, most other platforms other than ASC's install of Drupal that I'm aware of, like, WordPress, Squarespace, Wix, all these other, what you see is what you get editors all include font size as an option for that, and ours does not. So, yeah.
Okay. I will make sure to check into it. And as I am talking, I'm also going to look at it and see if I can give you an answer now.
I'm fully expecting the answer to be, we've disabled that because the vast majority of people can't use it responsibly, but.
Okay. Be that as may, I will find out.
It's something I could also ask to our developers, Brian and Michael Lee, because I think they'll most likely know the real answer behind that. But yeah, that's a really good question. We still have some time for maybe one or two more questions if anybody has anything. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions popping up in chat. So do you all feel like we've answered your questions pretty satisfactory? And if you have any more questions about accessibility or anything related to Drupal, you could always drop a question in the Teams group. So that way you don't have to have anything immediately right now to ask. You're free to ask anytime if you have any questions related to that topic. But if there's nothing else, I think we can maybe wrap up here.
I'm gonna ask an alt
Yeah.
text question, I think.
Yeah, go
Um,
ahead.
Is there, I'm trying to figure out exactly how to ask this question. Is there like a preferred thing to put in alt text when the image is purely decorative because it is required by Drupal to be able to do the thing, right? In order to post a news story, I have to have an image, and no matter how many times I use, like, it doesn't help for you to know that this news story saying that we want to hire students or announce this award, that it is yet another picture of the oval seal at sunrise, you know, like, that's not helpful to the story, right?
Hmm.
It's purely decorative and purely a requirement of our posting system. Like, and if you're following us or following a lot of Ohio State news stuff, you're going to have had that stock image described to you 4 million times, right?
So
That's an
does that,
exact data point that I have surveyed. No, 4 million. No.
so would that mean that you would be interested in uploading, adding your own image to which you can then place a more meaningful, more appropriate alt text?
No, it's more to say that, like, is there like a standard way that I can just let the screen reader do what it needs to do, but tell the person depending on it, this is not important. Like, me taking the time to, as the screen reader, right? Me as the little bot reading to you, going through, image of, or steel on oval at sunset,
Yeah,
heading 1, title, blah, 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 right?
yeah.
That's just
The
wasting people's time and comprehension,
Yeah,
right?
the standard thing you'd want to do is to just leave the alt blank. And I'm hoping that if you
But
do
I
that in the
can't
Drupal
do that,
interface,
right?
oh, it doesn't. Oh, I see.
Yeah, I
Hmm.
don't, I don't know if that's another interesting, I mean, alt equals blank is obviously the most straightforward solution, but I'm not sure if Drupal will allow, I think I see Gabe's frustration. It may not be the case that it lets you do that.
Yeah, short of not being allowed to do that, the best thing to do is just to use the word decorative. And that
Okay, yeah,
people
that
encounter
might
that
be the thing that I was
enough
getting
that,
to.
yeah,
So that would tell the user that it's not the fact that I just didn't care to write an alt text. It's that I've taken the time to know that this does not, me describing this text is not helpful to your comprehension, or me describing this image is not helpful to your comprehension.
Right,
So
yeah.
just saying decorative. Okay,
yes.
And I guess since you said that
awesome.
this isn't a solution for everyone, but since you said that earlier that you were comfortable editing the code, I'm assuming you could probably put a word in there and then in the code take it out. I know
Mhm.
that's extra work for you, but that would be
Yeah.
the ideal.
So when the alt text is left blank, do users assume good or bad intention?
The image is not supposed to be announced at all, so they won't even know it's
Okay,
there. That's the intended behavior.
excellent. Okay,
So it just
Now, that's not the
eliminates,
same as leaving. Now, if you leave out the alt attribute completely, then it'll just say image with no
Hmm.
description. And that's a bad thing. So it's a little bit nuanced. You have to make
Yeah,
sure it's there and empty.
gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Okay, it does. Thank you.
Cool.
Yeah, I think that was great. We are at noon now, so I'm gonna wrap things up here. thank you for tuning in, everyone. I know it's a particularly busy and stressful part of the semester, so I really do appreciate you stopping by for this and getting to meet the accessibility team of the web services team. So if you have any more questions related to accessibility, feel free to reach out to Abhijit, Jeff, or Alex. You're also welcome to post in the Teams group if you have any questions, and we can get right back to you on that. So again, we thank you for stopping by. We do plan in the future to have very similar events like this related to accessibility. We will keep you posted when we have things in the works like that. So again, I appreciate everyone's time here, and thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.
Yep. You have a great day, everyone.